I was midway through fixing a loose board on my front porch when I heard the dreaded sound of heels clicking against pavement. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. Margaret Finley, the self-appointed dictator of our HOA, had a way of making her presence known, usually through passive-aggressive notes left on doors or by ambushing residents with nonsense violations. "Mr. Nolan Jennings," she said, her voice as sharp as ever. "We need to talk." I exhaled, wiping my hands on my jeans before standing up. "What now, Margaret?" She pursed her lips in that disapproving way she always did. "Your property has become a problem." I raised an eyebrow. "A problem?" She nodded, glancing around dramatically as if about to reveal some damning secret. "Yes, we, the HOA, have ruled that your front yard has unofficially become a playground for the neighborhood children. That makes it a liability and, therefore, under our jurisdiction." I blinked. "What?" She crossed her arms. "Your yard is too inviting. Kids are always playing on your lawn, on your porch, even near your driveway. It's disrupting the aesthetic of the neighborhood." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "You're telling me my house is too fun?" She ignored my sarcasm. "We've decided to classify your property as a recreational space." I let out a short laugh. "That's ridiculous. That's not how property ownership works." Margaret gave me the kind of look reserved for unruly children. "Actually, it is. According to the HOA's bylaws, if a property is regularly used for community recreation, it can be designated as such under our governance." I folded my arms. "That's not legal." "It is within HOA authority," she insisted. "And as such, we'll be implementing new rules to reflect this change. We'll need to approve any modifications you make to your property, and of course, there will be a monthly maintenance fee for the upkeep of this playground." I barked out a laugh. "You're trying to charge me for my own house?" Margaret smiled as if she'd been waiting for this. "It's not your house anymore, Nolan. It's a shared space now." I felt my blood pressure spike. "You have no legal right to do this." She pulled out a folder, flipping it open to reveal a stack of official-looking documents. "Oh, but we do. The board has already approved it. You'll receive the official notice in the mail, but I thought I'd be courteous and tell you in person." I clenched my jaw, my mind racing. This had to be a joke. A prank. Some new level of HOA insanity. But the smug way she stood there told me she fully believed she could get away with this. Then I remembered something. Something Margaret had no clue about. I took a slow breath and gave her a long look. "You're making a mistake, Margaret." She tilted her head. "Oh? And why is that?" I smiled, but not for the reason she thought. "Because my uncle just became the new state governor." Margaret's smug expression faltered. And I said, stepping closer, "He's made homeowner association abuse one of his top priorities. Which means I have direct access to the man overseeing all HOA regulations in the state." Margaret's face paled. Now this was going to be fun. Margaret's face twitched ever so slightly, her confidence flickering like a candle in the wind. She had walked onto my property believing she had already won, expecting me to bow down to her ridiculous decree. Instead, she was now staring at a man with a direct line to the state's top authority on HOA regulations. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, as if flipping a switch, she forced a polite but brittle smile. "That's interesting," she said carefully. "But I assure you, everything we're doing is within the legal limits of the HOA's authority." I let out a slow breath, crossing my arms. "I highly doubt that, but let's test it, shall we?" Margaret's fingers twitched around the folder she was holding. Her eyes darted toward her car parked at the curb, as if debating whether she should make a hasty retreat. But she wasn't the type to back down easily. "The board has already made its decision," she said, her voice regaining some of its edge. "If you have an issue, you're welcome to bring it up at the next HOA meeting." I tilted my head. "Oh, I'll be there. But I won't be alone." Something in the way I said it made her posture stiffen. She gave me one last scrutinizing look before turning on her heel and striding toward her car. I watched as she climbed into the driver's seat, her movements a little too rigid, a little too forced. Then, without another word, she sped off down the street. As soon as she was gone, I pulled out my phone. It was time to make a call. The line rang twice before I heard the familiar voice of my uncle, Governor Richard Jennings. "Nolan," he greeted, sounding mildly surprised. Everything all right? I exhaled a quiet laugh. Depends on how you feel about HOAs trying to steal property. There was a pause. You're going to have to explain that one. I gave him a rundown of what had just happened, keeping the details sharp and to the point. By the time I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, finally, Richard let out a low chuckle. You know, I expected something like this to pop up eventually. Just didn't think it'd hit so close to home. I ran a hand through my hair. So, what do you think? Are they actually allowed to pull this nonsense? Absolutely not, Richard replied firmly. HOAs can't just declare private property as communal space. There are laws in place to prevent this kind of overreach. But if they're trying to push it through under some obscure bylaw, we'll need to dismantle their argument piece by piece. I nodded, already feeling a surge of determination. Tell me what I need to do. Start by gathering every document they send you, Richard instructed. Photograph every notice, every letter, every so-called regulation they try to enforce. If they hold a meeting about it, record it. The more evidence we have, the easier it'll be to shut this down. Got it, I said. And Nolan, Richard added, his tone sharpening, don't let them intimidate you. This is exactly the kind of abuse we're working to put an end to. I let out a breath, a slow grin forming. Oh, believe me, they just picked the wrong house to mess with. Over the next few days, the HOA's determination to enforce their absurd ruling became painfully clear. First, they started sending notices, official-looking letters stuffed into my mailbox, each one outlining the new regulations that supposedly governed my property. They listed restrictions on what I could do with my yard, including a ban on any modifications without HOA approval. They even had the audacity to demand that I pay a maintenance fee for landscaping upkeep, despite the fact that I had always taken care of my own lawn. I made sure to scan and document every single one. Then things escalated. Margaret and two HOA board members, one of whom I recognized as her ever-loyal crony, Gerald, showed up unannounced one afternoon, clipboards in hand. I was in my garage, organizing some tools, when I saw them approaching. Margaret cleared her throat. Mr. Jennings, we need to conduct an inspection. I leaned against the garage door, studying their expressions. Inspection for what? Gerald adjusted his glasses. To ensure the new regulations are being followed. I let out a slow exhale. You're not stepping a foot onto my property without a warrant. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. We don't need a warrant. This is an HOA matter. No, I said flatly. It's a private property matter. And unless you have legal documents proving otherwise, you're trespassing. Gerald opened his mouth to argue, but Margaret placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. She forced another one of her tight smiles. We're trying to be reasonable here. I narrowed my eyes. No, you're trying to seize control over something that isn't yours. She held my gaze for a moment, then exhaled sharply. Fine. If you won't cooperate, we'll take further action. I watched as they turned and walked away, their frustration evident. I had a feeling they weren't done. That night, I got a call from my neighbor, Lisa. You're not going to believe this, she said, her voice laced with anger. I just got a letter from the HOA saying they're increasing our fees to cover community maintenance costs. I frowned. Let me guess, because my property is now a shared space? Bingo, she said grimly. They're trying to make us all pay for their nonsense. That was the final straw. I spent the next few hours preparing. I printed out every document, every notice, every attempt they'd made to enforce their absurd rules. I compiled a list of state laws that completely contradicted their claims. And then I made one final call to Richard. The next HOA meeting is in 2 days, I told him. I want to shut this down in front of the entire neighborhood. Richard chuckled. Sounds like a plan. I'll make sure you have everything you need. Margaret thought she could bully me into submission. She had no idea that I was about to turn her entire scheme into a public spectacle. The night before the HOA meeting, I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing every piece of evidence I had gathered. My uncle had sent over a list of legal precedents, each one proving beyond a doubt that the HOA had no authority to declare my property a communal space. I had printouts of state laws, homeowner rights, and even court cases where similar HOA overreach had been struck down. I wasn't just going to argue my case, I was going to dismantle Margaret's entire scheme in front of the entire neighborhood. By the time I finished organizing everything, I felt a deep, settled confidence. I wasn't just prepared. I was ready to put an end to this nonsense once and for all. The next evening, I arrived at the community center early. The HOA meetings were usually held in a bland, beige room with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Rows of metal folding chairs were arranged in front of a long table where the board members sat, looking down at the residents like a panel of self-important judges. Margaret was already there, seated in the center of the table like a queen on her throne. Gerald sat to her right, his usual smugness replaced with something more cautious. The other board members were whispering among themselves, throwing occasional glances my way. Word had gotten out. People knew this meeting was going to be different. By the time the room filled up, it was standing room only. Neighbors who usually skipped these meetings had shown up, murmuring amongst themselves. Lisa gave me a nod from the back of the room. Even people who had never openly opposed the HOA seemed curious, eager to see what would unfold. Margaret cleared her throat and tapped a pen against her clipboard. The room quieted down. "We'll begin this meeting by addressing a matter of significant importance to the community," she announced. "As many of you are aware, the HOA has deemed Mr. Jennings' property a designated recreational space due to its frequent use by neighborhood children." A few people in the audience frowned. Whispers spread. Margaret continued, undeterred. "This change ensures that the area remains safe and properly maintained. However, it has come to my attention that Mr. Jennings has refused to comply with the necessary adjustments." I stood up. "Because what you're doing is illegal." Margaret's expression barely shifted. "We have reviewed our bylaws, and the board has determined this decision falls within our authority." I walked toward the front, holding up a stack of papers. "Then you won't mind if we go over a few things, will you?" Margaret hesitated, but she couldn't exactly refuse without looking like she was hiding something. "Proceed." I set my documents on the table. "First, let's start with state law. According to property statutes, an HOA cannot reclassify private property as communal land without the owner's consent. You have no authority to dictate how my land is used." Gerald scoffed. "The community's use of your yard makes it a shared space." I smiled. "Funny, because legally that's not how it works. Just because kids play on my lawn doesn't mean it stops being my property. If that were the case, every driveway kids ride their bikes on would suddenly belong to the HOA." The audience chuckled. Margaret's jaw tightened. I flipped to the next section of my evidence. "Secondly, I looked into the supposed bylaw you're citing, the one about recreational spaces. Turns out it was added to the HOA guidelines only last month, and it was never voted on by homeowners." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret's fingers curled around her clipboard. "The board has the authority to make adjustments in the best interest of the community." I raised an eyebrow. "Actually, you don't. HOA amendments require a community vote unless explicitly stated otherwise in the original charter. And according to the official HOA agreement everyone signed when they moved here, major changes to property classifications require a 2/3 majority from homeowners." Lisa stood up from the back. "Yeah. Funny how none of us voted on this." Other neighbors started nodding in agreement. Margaret's composure faltered for the first time. The board was acting in the neighborhood's best interest. I cut her off. "And let's talk about that maintenance fee you're trying to charge me and my neighbors. You're demanding extra payments for landscaping that I've always handled myself. That's called financial coercion, and it's illegal." Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "The funds are necessary to ensure the upkeep of shared spaces." I leaned forward. "Except my property isn't a shared space. And you know it." Margaret opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a firm voice cut through the room. "That's enough." Every head turned as my uncle, Governor Richard Jennings, stepped into the room. A collective gasp spread through the crowd. Margaret went rigid. Gerald looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Richard strode to the front of the room, his expression unreadable. "I've been reviewing this situation, and I have serious concerns about how this HOA is operating." Margaret finally found her voice. "Governor Jennings, this is a private HOA matter. With all due respect, your presence here is unnecessary." Richard gave her a cool stare. "On the contrary, my office has been receiving multiple complaints about HOA overreach in this community. And as the newly appointed governor overseeing housing regulations, I have every reason to be here." Margaret's face lost all color. Richard turned to the crowd. Let me be clear, the HOA has no legal grounds to reclassify private property. Any attempt to do so without homeowner consent is fraudulent. A wave of satisfaction rolled through me as the audience murmured in agreement. Richard faced Margaret again. Furthermore, I will be launching an official investigation into the HOA's financial practices, including these so-called maintenance fees. If we find any evidence of mismanagement or coercion, there will be legal consequences. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her clipboard. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Richard glanced at me. Nolan, do you have anything else to add? I smiled. Just one thing. I turned to the crowd. If you're tired of this HOA abusing its power, it's time we take action. We can vote to remove the board and elect members who actually represent our interests. The room erupted in applause. Margaret looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Gerald slumped in his chair, defeated. Richard nodded approvingly. Then let's make it official. All in favor of removing the current HOA board. Nearly every hand shot up. Margaret's reign was over. As the meeting concluded, neighbors came up to thank me, shaking my hand and expressing their relief. Margaret and Gerald slipped out quietly, their once untouchable authority shattered. Lisa clapped me on the back. You really did it. I exhaled, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. We all did. Margaret had thought she could manipulate and bully her way into power. But in the end, justice and the entire neighborhood had turned against her. The aftermath of the HOA meeting left the neighborhood buzzing. Conversations spilled onto sidewalks, people gathering in clusters to discuss what had just happened. For the first time in years, there was an electric sense of possibility in the air, like a long-standing weight had finally been lifted from everyone's shoulders. I lingered outside the community center, shaking hands with neighbors as they filed out. Lisa was still grinning as she recounted Margaret's silent retreat to some of the other residents. Even those who had never openly opposed the HOA before seemed emboldened now, their hushed complaints turning into full-fledged discussions about what needed to change. Richard, my uncle, stood beside me, arms crossed as he observed the dispersing crowd. There was a sharpness in his gaze, a quiet assessment of everything that had transpired. Margaret and Gerald had left without a word, their usual air of superiority completely shattered. But I knew better than to think they'd slink away without some last-ditch attempt to regain control. Richard glanced at me. They won't take this lying down. I nodded. Margaret's too stubborn for that. She'll try something. She might. But after tonight, she doesn't have the board to back her up. Richard's tone was measured. And with an official investigation into the HOA's finances underway, she'll have bigger problems to worry about. The thought brought a quiet satisfaction. Whatever Margaret had been doing behind the scenes, whether it was misusing funds or manipulating rules for her own gain, was about to be dragged into the light. Lisa joined us, arms crossed. I almost can't believe it actually happened. The vote, the way everyone turned against them, it's like the whole neighborhood just woke up at once. I exhaled. They finally realized they didn't have to put up with it. She shook her head. For years, people were too scared to push back. Margaret had them convinced she could ruin their lives with fines and threats. But the second they saw someone stand up to her and win, it was over. Richard gave a small nod. That's how people like her operate. They rely on fear. Take that away and they have nothing. I looked at the community center doors, now shut for the night. We need to make sure this change sticks. Just because we voted them out doesn't mean the HOA is fixed. We need new leadership, people who actually care about the neighborhood. Lisa smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Because a few of us have been talking and we think you should step up. I blinked. Wait, what? She gestured to a small group of neighbors nearby. A lot of people trust you now. You know how to push back against corruption and you actually care about the community. You'd be a perfect HOA president. I laughed, shaking my head. You want me to run the HOA I just spent weeks fighting? Lisa grinned. Exactly. Richard chuckled. It's not a bad idea. I rubbed the back of my neck. I was just trying to stop Margaret from pulling another scam. I wasn't planning on running the place. Lisa shrugged. Think about it. At least we'd know the HOA wouldn't turn into another power-hungry mess. I sighed, but I couldn't deny the logic. If we didn't put responsible people in charge, someone else could come along and pick up where Margaret left off. I'll think about it, I said. Lisa patted my arm. That's all we ask. As she walked off, I glanced over at Richard. He was watching me with the same calculating expression he always had when weighing a decision. You'd be good at it, he said. I huffed. You're supposed to be on my side. He smirked. I am. That's why I'm telling you to consider it. I shook my head, but I knew I'd have to make a decision soon. For now, though, there was something more pressing to deal with. Margaret wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly, and I had a feeling she was already planning her next move. The next morning, I found out just how right I was. I was drinking coffee on my porch when Lisa called. There was an edge to her voice, something urgent. You need to see this. I frowned. See what? Check your mailbox. I walked down my driveway, pulling open the metal flap. Inside was a bright red envelope, the kind the HOA usually used for violation notices. I tore it open and scanned the letter inside. Margaret's name was still on the letterhead, but the contents were different from the usual nonsense she sent. It was a lawsuit. She was suing me for damages to the HOA's reputation and obstruction of established community regulations. I exhaled slowly, reading over the ridiculous claims. It was a last-ditch attempt to intimidate me, to make me back off now that she had lost her power. Lisa was still on the line. You see it? Yeah, I said. She's trying to drag this into court. She sent them to half the neighborhood, Lisa said. Anyone who voted against her got one. I clenched my jaw. Margaret wasn't just lashing out at me, she was trying to scare everyone back into submission. But she had underestimated just how far I was willing to go. I took my coffee back inside, pulled out my phone, and called Richard. When he answered, I kept my voice steady. We need to talk. He sighed, already knowing. She's suing, isn't she? Not just me. Everyone who voted against her. Richard was silent for a moment. Then, with a calm certainty, he said, then it's time we end this for good. Margaret thought she could use the legal system as a weapon. She had no idea she was about to lose on every front. As soon as I hung up with Richard, I set the lawsuit letter down on the table and took a deep breath. Margaret had just made her final, desperate move, and it was as ridiculous as I expected it to be. She was banking on fear, hoping that the threat of a lawsuit would make people back down. But she had overplayed her hand. Margaret no longer had the HOA board to shield her. The community had turned against her. And now she had filed a lawsuit that had no legal standing, using arguments that would crumble under the slightest scrutiny. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. Lisa was already waiting for me at her house down the street. She had her arms crossed, the letter in her hand, her mouth pressed into a thin line. A couple of other neighbors had gathered on her porch, all holding identical red envelopes. This is insane, Lisa said as I walked up. She's suing half the neighborhood? I glanced at the group, recognizing a few faces from the meeting. They looked concerned, but not scared. Margaret's intimidation tactics were losing their power. She's bluffing, I said. This lawsuit won't hold up in court. She has no authority anymore. Lisa shook her head. She's trying to drag everyone through legal fees. She knows most people don't want to deal with that kind of hassle. She was right about that. Even if the lawsuit was baseless, it would still take time and money to fight it. And Margaret was counting on people giving in just to avoid the headache. But she had underestimated her opponents. I pulled out my phone and dialed Richard again. He picked up immediately. I was expecting your call, he said. She's suing everyone who voted her out, I told him. She knows she's going to lose, but she's trying to make it expensive. Richard let out a slow breath. All right, here's what we're going to do. He laid out the plan. First, he was going to have his legal team review the lawsuit and prepare a response. Then, he would contact the state attorney's office to report Margaret's abuse of legal process. Finally, he would make sure the press got wind of this, because if Margaret wanted to play dirty, we were going to expose every single move she made. When I hung up, I turned to Lisa and the others. Richard's handling this, I said. We're going to fight it, and we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what Margaret is trying to pull. One of the neighbors, an older man named Frank, nodded. About time someone put a stop to her nonsense. Lisa exhaled, relief visible on her face. Good, because I'm not paying a single cent to fight this ridiculous lawsuit. You won't have to, I assured her. Margaret's the one who's going to regret this. By the next day, Richard's legal team had already drafted a response. They filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit on the grounds that it had no legal merit. At the same time, Richard made a few calls to some local reporters. It didn't take long for the story to spread. Within 48 hours, headlines started popping up in local news outlets. Disgraced HOA president sues entire neighborhood after losing power. Former HOA leader faces investigation for financial misconduct. Residents fight back against abusive HOA practices. Margaret had spent years controlling the narrative in our neighborhood, but now the story was being told by people who weren't under her thumb. And she was losing control fast. The real breaking point came when a state investigator showed up at her house. Richard had pulled some strings, making sure that the financial investigation into the HOA was moving at full speed. Margaret tried to brush it off at first, but then the investigator handed her a formal subpoena. She was being ordered to turn over all HOA financial records from the past 5 years. And that was when everything fell apart. Because Margaret had a lot to hide. It turned out that she had been redirecting HOA funds for years. Community dues that were supposed to go toward maintenance and neighborhood improvements had instead been used to cover personal expenses. Luxury vacations, high-end furniture, even private spa treatments, it was all there, hidden under vague line items in the HOA's financial reports. And now she was caught. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had once feared Margaret were now openly laughing at her downfall. Lisa called me the moment she heard. "They've got her," she said, barely containing her excitement. "The state investigators found everything. She's going down." I grinned. She had it coming. Margaret had spent years wielding power like a weapon, using fear to keep people in line. But now she was the one backed into a corner, with nowhere left to run. By the end of the week, the lawsuit she had filed against me and the other residents was officially dismissed. The judge didn't even let it go to trial. He threw it out immediately, calling it a frivolous and retaliatory lawsuit. And Margaret? She was facing criminal charges for financial fraud. I stood on my porch that evening watching as a moving truck pulled up in front of Margaret's house. She had no choice but to sell. With the HOA investigation exposing her corruption and legal fees piling up, she couldn't afford to stay. I watched as she stepped outside, looking around the neighborhood one last time. She caught sight of me, and for a moment I thought she might say something. But she didn't. She just turned away, climbed into her car, and drove off. Lisa walked over, watching her leave. "Think she'll try to pull this somewhere else?" I shook my head. "Not if the state has anything to say about it." Margaret had spent years acting like she was untouchable. But in the end, she was just another corrupt HOA tyrant who had finally been held accountable. And the neighborhood? It was finally free. As Margaret's car disappeared down the street, a quiet sense of finality settled over the neighborhood. The woman who had spent years ruling with an iron fist, who had tried to manipulate, intimidate, and even sue her way back into power, was gone. For the first time in a long while, the community was free from her relentless grip. Lisa exhaled, watching the last of Margaret's belongings get packed into the moving truck. The workers moved with practiced efficiency, loading up the remnants of a life built on control and deceit. The sun had begun its descent, casting golden light over the houses. A few neighbors stood nearby, some talking in hushed tones, others simply observing. It wasn't just curiosity that kept them there, it was relief. The tension that had lingered for years had finally lifted. Lisa shifted her weight slightly. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" It did. The absence of Margaret's constant interference left behind an unfamiliar quiet, a space that had once been filled with her demands, fines, and absurd rules. I nodded. "Yeah, but a good kind of weird." She glanced at the moving truck. I half expected her to try one last power move before leaving. She knew there was no way out, I said. The legal system wasn't on her side anymore. She had nowhere left to run. A few other neighbors had gathered near the sidewalk, watching as the last of Margaret's possessions were carted away. Among them was Frank, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than most. He had seen more than his fair share of HOA drama over the years, but even he looked somewhat surprised by how quickly everything had unraveled. He shook his head, crossing his arms. "Never thought I'd see the day. That woman thought she was untouchable." Lisa glanced at me. "You really set everything in motion, you know." I shrugged. "She did it to herself." Frank nodded. Still, someone had to stand up to her. It's about time someone reminded these HOA types that they don't own us. A murmur of agreement passed through the small group. The neighborhood had been under Margaret's rule for so long that many had forgotten what it was like to live without the constant fear of fines and sudden rule changes. Lisa reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. Speaking of the HOA, she said, unfolding it, we still need to figure out what happens next. The paper was a petition, a formal request to restructure the HOA with new leadership. It had already gathered a significant number of signatures. Lisa tapped the bottom of the page. The way I see it, we have two options. We either elect a new board that actually listens to the community, or we dissolve the HOA altogether. Frank raised an eyebrow. Is that even possible? I nodded. It is. It'd take a majority vote, but if enough homeowners agree, we can shut it down completely. Lisa exhaled. That would mean no more HOA at all. No board, no dues, no rules beyond the city's ordinances. Frank looked thoughtful. That sounds tempting. A few of the other neighbors murmured in agreement. The idea of getting rid of the HOA entirely was appealing, especially after everything Margaret had put them through. But there were still practical matters to consider. Lisa glanced at me. If we dissolve it, that means no one to handle community maintenance. No one to deal with disputes. Frank gave a dry chuckle. No one to send out ridiculous fines for having the wrong shade of curtains either. I considered the options carefully. While getting rid of the HOA would mean an end to unnecessary interference, it could also lead to issues down the line. Some form of community organization could be beneficial, just not one ruled by power-hungry individuals like Margaret. I exhaled. We could restructure instead. Keep the HOA but rewrite the bylaws to limit its authority. Make it something that actually benefits the community instead of controlling it. Lisa nodded. That way we keep the good parts like neighborhood events and upkeep without the dictatorship. Frank rubbed his chin. But that means we'd need people we trust to run it. Lisa turned to me. That's why I still think you should take the lead. I let out a short laugh. You're really not letting it go, are you? She grinned. Nope. Frank chuckled. She's got a point. You already fought to protect the neighborhood. Might as well make sure things stay fair. I ran a hand through my hair, considering it. The idea of running an HOA wasn't exactly appealing, but if it meant preventing another Margaret from rising to power, maybe it was worth it. Lisa smirked. Come on. You get to make sure no one else tries to pull another stunt like this. I sighed. Fine. But only if we do this right. No hidden rules. No surprise fines. Just a fair system that actually helps people. Lisa fist pumped. Now that's what I'm talking about. Frank grinned. Looks like we've got ourselves a new HOA leader. The group around us clapped and nodded in agreement. The decision had been made. For the first time in years, the neighborhood had a chance to rebuild, this time without fear. As the moving truck pulled away, taking the last remnants of Margaret's reign with it, I looked around at the people who had come together to take back their community. Margaret had thought she could control them forever. She had never expected them to fight back. And now the neighborhood was finally free to thrive on its own terms.